The following is an independently produced community access program. The viewpoints expressed are those of the community access producer and do not reflect those of Shaw Cable Systems. The program is presented in response to CRTC policy guidelines regulating community programming.
Welcome to Island Justice with Roger Batchelor. Today we've got Jonathan Arnold as a guest, and Jonathan is a criminal and family lawyer, and he's here to talk primarily about his Museum of Legal Ephemeron.
That's right.
Thank you. So Jonathan, before we get into everything, I just wanted you to talk a little bit about some of your interests. I know that you're interested in doing some acting, and in fact have just found a part in a big movie. So maybe you could talk about how you ended up getting that part.
It was actually just out of the blue. I read in the Times Colonist that a local film studio called Bay Film Studios was opening up in Maple Bay, which is near Duncan, and that one of the investors was Adam Beach, who people may recognize from the Sands of Iwo Jima or Flags of Our Fathers, the Clint Eastwood films, and Wind Talkers. And so they were looking for people for this movie that they were going to be shooting called Dating.com. And so I decided to go up there on a whim and drove up there and walked in, never having done this before, and auditioned for a part. And one thing led to another, and they essentially offered me a role playing, of all things, an attorney.
Okay. So. And maybe you could tell us what happened when you went in for your second interview.
Well, it was again, not knowing what to expect. I mean, you enter a room, it's called the green room, and they give you a 1 or 2 liner to read. And you come in, you read the 1 or 2 liner, and I guess they base all the decisions on that. And then if they like you, they see you for a part, I guess, right there, which they did. They said, okay, well, just a second, we want you to stay. We normally don't do this. We see you playing potentially this part. Here's, a couple of pages. Can you go memorize them, come back and read for us? So I did, and came back and read the attorney's role for them, and they were happy. And right now they're in pre-production. They've built all the stages, and I understand they're just waiting for a break to have Adam Beach available to start filming.
And what did they ask you when you went back for the second interview?
They actually asked me what acting experience I had, and I try and be brutally honest in anything I do, and I said none. But I said I do work as a trial lawyer, so I walk into the courtroom every day, and a bit of that is playing to the crowd and theater and acting, so I said at least I've got that going for me. And that seemed to make them happy and satisfied.
Mm-hmm. And you've got some other interests in film. Maybe you could talk about what those interests are.
One of the things that I do just to relax from the vocation of law is script writing. So I'll go into my office and working on an idea. If the idea seems to be a good one, I'll develop it, write out a synopsis, write out a brief, and keep writing. I recently submitted a 165-page manuscript to the American Academy of Institute of Film and Arts. I probably got that wrong, but it's the folks that do the Academy Awards. And they have this fellowship they give out once a year to new screenwriters. And so I'm waiting to hear back from them on that.
So maybe we could talk a little bit more about some of the goodies that you brought today.
Sure.
I'll let you start off with showing whatever you'd like to show first and explaining to us what the significance of it. But just before we start that, Ephemeron.
Right.
Where did you get that name from?
Ephemeron derives from, by definition, a material thing that is of fleeting significance. So a piece of paper, a book, whatever it may be, that is important in the moment, but once that moment is passed, it's no longer of importance, basically. It becomes collectibles, it becomes garbage, it becomes whatever you want. And so I thought it was apt to what I was collecting. And when I was going through law school, we had this professor in first year law. His name was Peter Maddaw, Professor Maddaw, and he was a Socratic teacher. So if you're familiar with that type of teaching method, that's how he taught. And he taught at contracts very well, and he became very interested in it. And one of the things he talked about in contracts was a pivotal case called the carbolic smoke ball case. And this was a case where during an influenza outbreak in London, England, in the 1890s, I think, an ad was put in a London Illustrated News, which was a periodical much like Maclean's or Times or things like that. And basically what it did is that it guaranteed their product to cure you of influenza. Mm-hmm. And so this lady, based upon that ad, went out and bought this product. And the product said if you use it continuously as directed for 2 weeks, you won't get influenza. And if you do get influenza, we've put aside, I believe it was £100 or £1,000 in the bank. And if you do get it after using our product as directed, you can claim a reward, essentially. So she went out and got this product based upon that and used it. And sure enough, 2 weeks later, she got influenza. She survived. She went to the makers of the carbolic smoke ball, which was the carbolic smoke ball company, and asked for her reward. And they told her essentially to move along, and it wasn't intended to be an actual reward. It was just a form of advertising to lure people in. It was called, in that day, mere puffery. Mm-hmm. And so after being escorted to the door, she thought that wasn't fair, and she brought them to court and sued them, essentially, for that reward. This was the first time that someone had sued a company for an advertisement. The long and the short is that the course to terminate was what's called a unilateral contract. Mm-hmm. So if you were to put something out, Roger, and I were to read it, I don't have to write you a letter saying I agree to your terms. Mm-hmm. I don't have to visit you and say I agree to your terms or shake your hand. By putting it out there, you're making that contract available to anybody. Mm-hmm. And they don't have to necessarily meet you in person. But you're bound by it if that person follows the terms of that contract, which she had. Mm-hmm. And so the courts determined that she had in fact followed the terms of the contract, and that the company was liable for the reward, and she won her case. Mm-hmm. And essentially that started what we now see today as being the television advertisements, the magazine advertisements. How they're placed, how they're done is all carefully scripted, not to impute something such as a reward or a guarantee or a promise, so that they don't get sued. And it was all thanks to this lady back in 96 and her carbolic smoke ball that this happened. So the professor explained this to us, and I thought to myself that it might be interesting to go out and find that actual advertisement and own a piece of history. And that's what got me started.
So you actually have an ad from carbolic smoke ball?
I managed to find on eBay the actual ad itself that this lady would have read in the 1890s.
Nice.
And I purchased it through eBay, and I've got it at home. Mm-hmm. So that's what started the collecting. And I thought, you know what, this is a neat thing. It's neat to see the actual law, because I think law is perceived by most people as an unpassionate and an objective type of profession. And I don't think it has to be that way. Mm-hmm. I think law is perceived as something slightly above accounting in terms of, interest to the general public. Mm-hmm. It's not something that you go to a party and when you say I'm a lawyer, there's a burst of conversation that happens. And I thought that was sad, because I think there is a lot about law that can be interesting and can be talked about.
So let's start with the bottle.
Sure.
What's the bottle for?
This bottle is from Paisley, Scotland. It's an actual bottle from what would have been known as the Donahue and Stevenson case. And this is another pivotal modern law case. It's a corporate commercial case now. And essentially it was a case of a young lady by the name of Donahue, I believe, that went into this pub in Paisley, Scotland, and ordered a ginger beer. And it came in this bottle, this very bottle. Mm-hmm. As you can see, it's very hard to see through, so she couldn't see the contents of it. She claims while she was pouring her ginger beer out, a snail fell into her bottle, or her glass rather, from the bottle. She then began to drink it and choked on the snail. And when she poured the rest of it out and the snail fell out, She had a fit, I think they called it. So she passed out, or she went into hysterics or something to that, and had to be treated for the shock that she had incurred as a result of believing she had ingested a snail. Back in the day, you took your chances with products that you bought. That's the way it was. If you bought a product off the shelf, you took your chances with it. There was no guarantee that it would be safe, or would be effective, or would be as described. She decided to sue the manufacturer. So she sued Stevenson, which was a ginger beer manufacturer, for not producing a safe product. And this was unheard of. And she was a lady that didn't have much money, in fact, but she had some anonymous donors that helped her out, and the case went up to the House of Lords, as it then was, and she won. And it began what's called the neighbor principle, which is essentially, if you're going to produce something in a factory, you've got to make it as good as if you were giving it to your neighbor. So that a person who receives that product can feel that that product is safe.
Okay. Now, you've got something here with some, looks like might be Cyrillic letters on it. What would that be? Right.
This is a rare book. Not many of these survived. This is a copy of the criminal code of the USSR, and this is from 1950, so shortly after the war. It's what's called the Stalinist Code. A prosecutor in communist Soviet Union would have carried this around from village to village, prosecuting people. And I use that term loosely. Most of these people got sent to the gulags, or were killed, or were imprisoned for dozens and dozens of years based on the principles contained within this book. This is what began the purges in the Ukraine, came from this book. And so not many of these survived. I was fortunate to get my hands on one, and this is one that made it out.
Okay, and how about this book?
This is an interesting book. This book is an older book. It dates from, I believe, the 1600s. And it's a book of, I'll read it, The Pleadings for the Marquis de Gevres against the Marquise, Volume 2. And essentially, back in the day, people who were royalty, who wanted to abandon their marriage, would have to plead to the courts for a just reason to do so. And how they do that is that they would write a book. And so in this particular case, the Marquise beat the Marquis to the book writing, as she wrote her book first. And she claimed all kinds of things, like he was unable to make a baby. He was a horrible lover. He cheated on her. He was a mean person, all those type of things. And so he wrote this book to reply, saying things like, essentially, she had cheated on him, and that she had abandoned religion, and all kinds of things. So these were the type of things. And once the books were received by the court, they'd be considered by the king and by the court, and a finding would be had. So this is one of these books.
Very interesting. Now, you've got the Ruby trial here, and maybe you could tell us what the Ruby trial is. And
right. This is moving forward a bit to the 1960s. So this is called Inside the Ruby Trial, and this was essentially a souvenir magazine that you could buy for people that were going in to watch the Ruby trial. And Ruby was a gentleman who shot Oswald, who we all know who shot Kennedy.
Okay. We're just going to take a short break. We'll be back in a few minutes with Jonathan Arnold, family and criminal lawyer.
You're watching an independently produced community access program. The viewpoints expressed are those of the community access producer and do not reflect those of Shaw Cable Systems. The program is presented in response to CRTC policy guidelines regulating community programming.
Welcome back to Island Justice with Roger Batchelor. Today we've got Jonathan Arnold, who's a criminal and family lawyer in the area, but more interestingly, also is the curator of the Museum of Legal Ephemeron.
That's right.
And we've been talking about some of the things that he has in his museum, and perhaps you could tell us about the cards.
Sure, these are kind of fun. They've got a good story behind them. These were the first bubblegum cards produced. So these were the first cards to come with bubblegum in the wrappers. They're called G-Man and Heroes of the Law. And they were made during the time of rum runners and gangs like Al Capone to counteract the idolization of those type of individuals. So these were produced countrywide in the States. The kids used to collect them, and they've got numbers on the back. You can see number 15, 162, and 84. Now, the interesting thing is that they were produced specifically without sequential numbers. And so the kids used to keep buying these packs, trying to build a collection that you could never build because there were numbers missing.
Oh my goodness.
So some irony there, I think, in terms of when you're dealing with the law. But yeah, these were the first cards to come with bubblegum in their wrapper.
Okay, and how about crime punishment illustrations?
Well, these were crime comic books. And I'll take these out because I don't want to have a great big shine in the audience's eyes. So called Crime and Punishment. And I've got two examples. This is from 1949. It's a crime comic book. When these first came out, they became very, very popular, and there was a large uprising by the Christian community in the States because these showed criminals as being somewhat heroic or adventurous, that type of thing. And so they lobbied to the point that the U.S. Congress instituted legislation that these comics had to go through a certain standard before they could be published by law. And that came up with what's called the Comic Code. And this is still on comic books today. And the same thing happened here as well. Now, what's interesting about that is that you also see the same uproar coming with video games.
That's right.
And so the modern version of that is video games now today. On a side note, it is actually, believe it or not, still in the books in the Canadian Criminal Code. It's illegal to trade or sell in crime comic books in Canada.
Really?
Yes.
Oh my goodness. Now I see some fingerprints here.
Mm-hmm. Now this is from the darker days of our recent history. What you see here is what was called a facsimile or an old-fashioned photocopy. But this is an original document from the World War II Nuremberg trials. And this is the booking registration of a general called Hermann Reineck, and he was the highest general of the German Wehrmacht, or the average soldier of the German army. And he was arrested for crimes against humanity. He was prosecuted in Nuremberg. He was sentenced, and his sentence was commuted after about 7 years, I believe. But this is a piece of evidence which would have been tendered at the Nuremberg trials themselves.
Wow. Now I actually recognize this one. Perhaps you could talk about these pictures.
Right. These three gentlemen that you see here are still being studied today. No one knows whether or not they're alive or not. These are the three guys that escaped Alcatraz and inspired the movie Escape from Alcatraz with Clint Eastwood. And Clint Eastwood ended up playing this fellow right here. What makes this picture interesting is that it is the original picture provided by the U.S. Federal Prison Service to the Hearst newspaper, the San Francisco Chronicle. And you can see it on the back here where they've used it several times, 1962, June 14th. And you've got June 12th here was used, and again they've used it in 1993. So this is a picture that you see in every souvenir book now when you go to Alcatraz. And it was taken from this photostat.
Wow. This one I found really interesting. Perhaps you could talk about this picture.
Sure. This was a picture that I decided to get after watching Al Pacino in his role of Serpico. Serpico, if the audience doesn't know, when he's reminding, was a cop in New York who decided that he was going to play the game straight, so not accept bribes. And he ended up getting shot by fellow officers, and they ended up cleaning out the New York City police precincts based on his testimony. And this one you have Ramsey Clark and Serpico himself during their testimony. This one's signed by Ramsey Clark and Frank Serpico. It was signed, looks like December 6, 1971 from their testimony. So this is an original signature of that.
I found this interesting because Serpico looks the exact same as the person who played Serpico on the TV on the movie.
Uncanny, it's identical.
It's identical.
Yeah, identical to Al Pacino's character.
Now, This one I found really interesting too. Perhaps you could talk about Mr. Falwell and what this...
Sure. I'll not show the other side of this one.
Okay.
Because we don't want this show to be rated R. But many people may remember a recent movie with Woody Harrelson in which he played the founder of the founder of Hustler magazine. He's a gentleman who ended up being shot and is in a wheelchair now. And they ended up having the case in the States that went all the way to the Supreme Court about the freedom of speech and expression. And it all started because the founder of Hustler published this tongue-in-cheek ad about Jerry Falwell and his first time. Again, I'll not go into it. But it's an interesting case, and the results was made into a movie. And it's still being talked about today, and it impacts the freedom of speech in the States. And this is the actual ad that caused that case to come into being.
Interesting. So before you go any further, one of the things I always ask my guests is about their most interesting case. And perhaps you could tell us what your most interesting case has been so far.
I'm glad you asked that. I don't know if I have an interesting case as much as a humorous case. When I graduated from law school, I was picked to work as a Crown prosecutor here in Victoria. And the first case I had was a case of a gentleman who drove his vehicle over an embankment into another person's fountain in front of their house. And so it was a drunk driving, basically, to use the common terminology. And this gentleman had chose to represent himself, and I was a prosecutor. And the issue was identification. We were having a hard time proving that this was the guy that was behind the wheel and this was the guy that the witnesses saw. And so the first witness happened to be a gentleman who used to be the former attorney for Oak Bay in that area. So he was a credible witness. I put him on the stand. I asked him the questions. And he honestly said he couldn't identify the individual because it was dark and he wasn't sure, but that the individual that he had seen, certainly seemed to be stumbling and have some indicia of what we call drunkenness. And so I rested my case with that individual, and I thought, well, I didn't get very far there. I'm going to have a tough time on this one, proving the identity. Fortunately for me, this gentleman who was representing himself got up and said, when you saw me in the bushes, and that was the end of the case. So identity became an easy thing after that.
Right. Interesting. So I actually recognize this picture as well. Perhaps you could tell us what this is. Yeah,
this is the fun part of the collection. I try and make the collection a bit of a pop collection as well. And I think no legal ephemera collection can be complete without a signed Judge Wapner People's Court photo. So this is an autographed copy. It says, "To Martha, best wishes, Judge Wapner." So I think we've pretty much covered it all once we have Judge Wapner in the collection.
Now you've got a large book down here.
This is another book. A lot of people can do various types of collecting in ephemera. You can collect really cheap things such as this Judge Wapner. That cost me maybe $6-7 to get. Or you can do much more expensive things such as antiquities, which this book represents. You saw a smaller book earlier. This is a book about Edward III in England. As you can see, it's a much larger book. It's an ancient calf-bound book as well in Old English. And this is a book on the treaties of the laws under Edward III. At this time, he was King of France as well, I believe. And the predominant language used in the high courts and in the royal circles was French. So even though he was an English king, the entire book's written in French. And it dates back to the, I believe, the 1600s as well. It's an interesting piece of history that survives today.
And where did you pick that up from?
Well, this one I also got from eBay, which has been my primary source. Although, that being said, I caution people that if you're going to be doing this, you have to make sure you investigate your source that you're buying from. So I try and get from sources that are either museum sellers or belong to a certification group, so I know that what I'm getting is authentic and is from the genuine, is a genuine article or the genuine source, so to speak.
So where are you located right now? Where's the museum located?
Right now the museum is online. It's got a Facebook following. It's got about 300 and some odd people on it from 60 plus countries around the world. that follow it. So whenever I get something new for the museum, I post it on the Facebook page, and all you have to do is go in and type Facebook Museum of Legal Ephemera, or Facebook M.O.L.E for short, and it'll come up. And so I post the items on there, a picture of the items and a little script just explaining the items, much as I've explained them to you today. It's done well. That's so far gotten the attention of some national publications for lawyers, such as a magazine called The National, and the Lawyers Weekly and that type of thing. Have published articles about the collection itself based on that.
Wow. And what about physically? Where are you located physically?
Well, I've talked to both UBC and UVic about trying to house a permanent collection, a rotating collection with them. The talks continue. They're slow. There's quite a process when you're dealing with universities to get it approved and into there. They have the space and they have the interest. My prime motivation for collecting this is not to keep it stored away for me, but to have people be able to view it. Ultimately, I like the collection to be able to something you can go in and see and touch and feel and realize that everything around you has evolved and developed from things you see in the collection. That the law itself isn't this static, boring mechanism, but it's an active, alive animal, if you were, that's constantly developing. And by saving snippets of the law and snippets of things in pop culture that people can relate to, I hope to inspire some children coming up to want to become lawyers. And perhaps one day have someone else collecting a snippet of something they were involved in, or a case they were involved in one day.
Which goes back to your piece about passion.
That's right, about passion in the law. And I found going through law school, you learn a lot, but there's not a lot of things you get to see or touch or feel or pass around and be able to realize that you're in touch with. So by having this collection, the hope is that people will come in and see it, feel attached to the collection, and want to know more about the law and how it affects them.
Wow. So what's your plans for the future?
Well, keep practicing, keep writing scripts, hopefully keep acting, doing many different things all at once, and hopefully get a permanent place for the collection where it can be seen by individuals and appreciated.
Okay. Well, thank you for joining us. Today we had Jonathan Arnold, who's a criminal and family lawyer in Victoria, and who's also the curator and creator of the Museum of Legal Ephemeron.
There we go.
Thank you very much for joining us.
The proceeding was an independently produced community access program. The viewpoints expressed are those of the community access producer and do not reflect those of Shaw Cable Systems. The program is presented in response to CRTC policy guidelines regulating community programming.